Welcome to Stories of Brisco and Bradshaw. I would be Bradshaw, and that would be your Chickasaw native, your Chickasaw Hall of Famer, Oklahoma's favorite son, Mr. Gerald Brisco. And we have got a Hall of Fame author today, Mr. Ian Douglas, a decided novelty, an incredible book. You've got to pick this thing up about black wrestlers and their history from 1880 to 1950. He's got tons of other good books out there about our friend Mr. Steve Kern, about the Bahamian Rhapsody, about Bahamas wrestling. He's got more books about wrestlers, about different territories. He is Mr. Ian Douglas. Ian, welcome to the show.
John, it's a pleasure to be here. I've watched you guys plenty of times, and it's an honor to finally be here. Thank you so much.
And you got
Well,
two
yeah,
books on our friend Steve Kern, which is awesome. We talked about that when they came out. You got a terrific topic with Steve.
Well, some people have told me that's two books too many, but
not
but I
about our brother Steve Kern, Ian. I mean, Steve. I mean, what story? I mean, his dad's story. You could probably write volumes and volumes just about Steve's dad's story, and it's a shame that our government has not recognized Colonel Kern, Pops as we called him back in the day, as a Congressional Medal of Honor. I mean, the guy surely deserved it. Shot down in two wars and survived, and one of the longest surviving POWs in the Vietnam War, was treated horrific during that time, as you know. But I really, what I really appreciate the stories on Steve and reminiscing about his dad. I've had some wonderful experiences just sitting and talking to the colonel about it, and Steve Kern played one of the classic ribs of all time on me with his dad. And before we get started, you do you know
I
the
I
story?
I do know the story. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll share it with everybody else. And we're wrestling over in Melbourne, and Steve's dad had just got out of POW, and he moved over to Melbourne. And we weren't really treating our POWs that well on the return of them, Vietnam and all that crap that was going down. But we were wrestling over there, and I said, man, at that time I hadn't met Pops, and so Steve, I'd love him. Okay, well, let's go. So he takes me down A1A, and I'm thinking, all these big, huge houses, Layfield type houses, we passed. And I said, man, all this propaganda about not treating our POWs well, looks like they're treating it pretty damn well. So we pulled in, and we passed this gate that's open. Steve makes a quick U-turn. That's kind of strange. So we pulled into this gated mansion, go down this really manicured, articulate type driveway, winding, and finally come up to this big mansion. She says, just go up there and knock on the door. Dad will be glad to meet you. I don't want to get out of the car. I'll turn the car around and all this stuff. And I'll buy it hook, line, and sinker. So I go up and I ring the doorbell. No answer. Ring the door. No answer. Said, Steve, is your dad really here? What do you He'll come. Hang on. He's old. He'll come to the door. I'm ringing again. Finally, this old guy comes to the door. And I've seen pictures of Pops, and this guy don't look like Pops. Mr. Kern or Colonel Kern? No, no. What do you want here? I said, I want to see Colonel Kern. Colonel Kern don't live here. The Kerns don't live here. What? No, you got the wrong address. She takes me down this long, winding driveway, John, and tells me his dad lived there. Go up there. I'm lucky I didn't get shot or thrown in jail for trespassing. I get back to the car, and Steve, of course, is just busting out laughing. I said, "You no good SOB. Why you doing that to me?" He
Steve
said,
was
"Don't
such a
worry."
big Steve was such a big ribber. I mean, he was unbelievable. He would
Huge.
send guys to a show that didn't exist. Like he said, guys, we're in Melbourne today, we're in Jacksonville today, and they get there and there was no show. He just thought it was funny. Steve was a heck of a ribber.
A heck of a ripper, and and that's just a small example, John, of what I mean. We've all heard the story about what he did to Mr. Perfect, Kurt Hennig. Had him arrested, for things that we shouldn't mention on this. But
Didn't he
yeah, but
didn't he play a rib didn't he play a rib on you during a scuba diving incident as well?
oh God, did he ever
It's one of the
twice?
best ever.
Yeah, we're diving. I like to say we're down 150 feet, but we're probably down about 25 feet out here in the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America, as they used to call it. Now I still have a hard time saying that, but it's Gulf of Mexico. So we're diving. their certification dive, but I want to come along. I'm already certified. I was diving in the Bahamas and all that stuff, So I had my card well ahead. My first dive was with Mark Lewin and King Curtis over on Surfers Paradise in Australia. And so we're diving, we go down. So we go down all the way down to the bottom there. All of a sudden, I'm swimming along, and you got to have buddy dive to encourage my buddy. So I'm swimming along. All of a sudden, I go to hit that regulator, and I'm not getting any air. And I'm not getting any air. Suck in there, man, I'm down. And so Perger, at this time, he knows what's going on because I'm starting, my body language is starting to panic. I guess I'm swelling up trying to get some air. He comes along, and I said, Steve, and the buddy breather, give me a regulator. And he goes, no, 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 no. What this guy done, man? I'm 125 feet below sea level. He comes up behind me and turned my tank off of my regulator. So I'm sucking dry air is all I'm sucking, and I'm starting to panic now. I've got my card, I've been bragging all day. You novice, you basic divers, I've been all the world diving here. I've come along to help you guys out. So, all of a sudden, I take that last little gas, man, and there's nothing there. I said, I'm lucky I didn't get to bend and die. I mean, current could have killed me right then and there. But I made it to the surface, and I got up there. Damn, something. And about that time, Kurt started laughing. When Kurt started laughing, I knew you SOB, you turned my regulator off. That's the type of ribs a guy would pull on you, though.
It's always a funny rib when somebody dies.
Yeah.
Oh,
And I could have died right there. I could have panicked and died, but
Yeah, knowing that Billy Robinson couldn't swim, he got Billy Robinson all decked out in the gear and then just shoved him into the water. And
Yeah.
Billy thought he was drowning, and then he said, "Hey, Billy, it's shallow. Why don't you just go ahead and stand up?" I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, and knowing that Billy could have killed him if he wanted to. Steve was an absolutely fearless ribber.
And I did the same thing to Billy Robbins too. I'm gonna take credit for it. I think that's where Kern got it. Billy and I had a friend had a boat, so we went out fishing off the coast here. And so Billy was pulling the lines. He got over on the diver's deck, on the big boats have those little decks on the back where you can come up, put your equipment on. So Billy's there, he's bending over, pulling, I think it's a bait or something like that we'd put out. And he bending over. And I look at my brother Jack, and he said, dude, you don't have a ball on you if you don't do it. I reached up and I kicked Billy up, not knowing at that time that Billy couldn't swim. So Billy goes head first into the water, and he's gasping and he's screaming, "Oh, I can't swim." And Jack said, "He can't swim, Gerald. What you gonna do now? He's gonna kill you once you get him on board here." I said, "I don't know, but I gotta get him up. We gotta get him up." He said, "No, we about it. It's you, little brother. You get him up." So I reached my head out at the same time I'm holding on to one of the tie-off eyes that they tie your docking boats on the eyes there. "All right, Billy, come on. I'm going to help you up if you promise not to kill me." He said, "I won't kill you now, but I'm not making a promise forever." So we pulled him up, and for months and months, Brisco today might be the day. So he never did kill me.
Like I say, it's always a funny rib when somebody dies.
Yeah. So we had to help us out here. The book, man, is just fantastic. And excuse me.
Hey, and Ian, while he's going for the book, I love the thing. I saw an interview you did, and it was fantastic. The reason you wrote this book, which I thought was really cool. When you got in the Hall of Fame and you realized you're the first black author in the Hall of Fame, or the only black author in the Hall of Fame, and then did you have? I'll let you tell the story because I don't want to take it from you.
Yeah, well, there were a few things going on here, but the statement you're alluding to was that when I realized that I'm looking at the 30 guys there, and I'm the only one who's black, that I felt this sense of responsibility, and I had people who were telling me like you're the best black wrestling author of all time. With your output, you're up there at the level with some of these guys who I respect a great deal and who are inspirations to me. And if I really was that guy, and people were going to be saying 10 years from now that Ian Douglas isn't writing about wrestling anymore, but he is the best black wrestling author of all time, then what did I want my legacy to be? And while I was in that position, what did I actually contribute to Black wrestling history? And so I kind of figured that it was my responsibility to undertake this challenge. We're missing Black pro wrestling history really prior to the 1950s. That's when people start paying attention and talking about Bobo Brazil and Bearcat Wright and Sweet Daddy Siki, and eventually guys like Sailor Art Thomas and Shag Thomas and Luther Lindsay. But the era prior to that really hasn't been sorted out. So, okay, I'm going to be the guy who's actually going to do this. And in doing that, if I can get this time period straightened out, then that makes it easier for other people who come later on. If they're going to write about Bobo Brazil or Bearcat Wright, they can do it with the understanding that here are all of the events that preceded them, and this is the legacy that their careers were jump started from.
You the book that Mr. Briscoe just held up was the one you're talking about, a decided novelty.
Yes.
It's you sent us all the notes on it. It's just tremendous. But the one thing I noticed was I don't know how many wrestlers you had total profile, maybe 20. But is that about right? Because the reason I asked that is that all there was? I mean, there
There,
weren't many black wrestlers, were there?
okay, so that's an excellent question. Stateside, you've probably got about 20 during that period who achieved significant notoriety or had careers that were traceable. You did have guys popping up here and there. Like for instance, in the early chapters, you have Ed Geared, who is a strong man who comes over from the Netherlands, and he really seems to be imported just to strengthen Johnny Meyer's claim to being a world champion, and then he's kind of discarded. Um, but in a lot of the southern states and in other areas of the country, it was almost a tradition to have an opening undercard match between two or more untrained, unskilled black wrestlers, and it wasn't a wrestling match, it was just a brawl, and the last man standing gets a few dollars. And so there's no they'd come up with some names for these guys that didn't track from show to show because they were sort of disposable entertainment. But you had a lot of guys who were brought in, for lack of a better term, for the novelty of it, just as almost pre-show entertainment, and then they were discarded. So the reason for the title, page one, it would be helpful if I explained that. In 1903, there was an editorial that was syndicated going around the northeastern states where the writer was lamenting the fact that there were really no skilled black wrestlers to speak of. And he said that a carnival, meaning a match, but a carnival between really clever colored wrestlers would be a decided novelty. And in my mind, that's sort of the way to bookend the whole thing was we go from the first decade of the 20th century where they're saying where the opportunity to have a match between two skilled black wrestlers doesn't exist. And by the middle of the century, it's gone from being a novelty to almost a necessity. And I thought that was the right way to sort of
Right.
bookend this thing.
Right. They always say, one person can change a lot of things, but that goes both ways. For every Frederick Douglass, you have a Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And and there's him and Cap Anson did as much to keep segregation in baseball as any two people, for 50 years. A nice warm place in hell is saved for those two guys. But as far as in wrestling, was there certain people that either kept it segregated or was more accepting to having black wrestlers that came in? Was there certain people that were voices for them or voices against them during this time?
it as far as voices for them, you have several news writers who, as for instance, Jack Johnson and Henry Armstrong and some of these black fighters, the original Joe Walcott, Barbados Joe Walcott. Um, it's becoming obvious that if enough black fighters are well trained, it's hard to keep them out of the upper echelons of the boxing ranks. And with professional wrestling being a work, um, the artificial and contrived nature of pro wrestling being what it is, they start to ask the question, well, why is it that we can get so many accomplished black fighters, but we can't get a single accomplished black wrestler? And and really it ends up being, I mean, we go into some names, we talk about you can't count Clarence Bolden because nobody knew that Clarence Bolden was black. But you but
Right.
you go to Illa Vincent and his ability to draw, and then you go to Reginald Siki Berry, who the Zabiscos grabbed and groomed and made him into a name. But it really
Hey, and I don't
takes,
mean to cut you off, but if you don't mind,
yeah.
define the Briscoes, because that's not the Zabiscos. That's not the
Okay.
Zabiscos of the current age. That's Stanislaus and the other
And
Zabiscos.
Vladek Zabisco, yeah,
Right.
the major the Zabisco brothers, and really they're traveling all-star troupe of wrestlers, and they saw value in being able to promote a black wrestler. And by the time they get out to Los Angeles, the newspapers start writing about how uh, Reginald Siki is now barbershop talk, and he's becoming a clear draw amongst black wrestling fans, and that's translating into money. But it really seemed to take George Godfrey, who a lot of people consider to be an uncrowned world heavyweight champion because he never received that opportunity. And I mean, he didn't do himself any favors because he also got accused of taking dives in several of his fights for payoffs. But it's really when he gets suspended from boxing and decides that he's going to become a wrestler, um, and he comes back to the U.S. and appears in wrestling shows in the Northeast, and he's out drawing guys like Jim Lundis. And that's when
Wow.
promoters seem to say, okay, wait a second, uh, maybe there's some money to be made, some serious money to be made by having a black wrestler featured on your shows. Maybe we can tap into this market and actually draw some dollars with some black wrestlers.
Yeah.
Right.
Uh, Ian, before we get too far into the book here, I'd like to kind of refresh people about your background and everything. You're from the Bahamas, and
Mm-mm.
no, where I'm sorry,
No, no, no.
where's your
I am from Southfield, Michigan, 9 Mile Road and Beach Road, just
okay? That's a long
north,
way from the Nassau, Bahamas.
just
I
north.
apologize for the Michigan
Oh,
thing.
oh no, you're fine. I need to be careful. I told you off air that I need to be careful about claiming the Bahamas because I wasn't born there. And I also need to be very careful about claiming Detroit because as someone who was raised 1 mile north and 1 mile west of Detroit's northwest border, the Detroiters will be quick to tell you I grew up in a somewhat softer environment.
Wow. So where did your love for our sport and our history of our sport? Because reading through your book and it's just amazing the passion that I find, and not only this book here, but the Bahamas book that you penned earlier, and so a couple of books on with some friends of mine that you penned, and one I'm waiting to come out. Mike Rotunda, is getting ready to come out. But where did your passion for the sport of professional wrestling come about?
You may laugh at it or you may not, but Randy Savage, 1986. I turned on the television. My parents did everything they could to keep me from watching wrestling. Like I knew about it from the periphery because people around me would be talking about WrestleMania and Hogan and Piper and Mr. T, but I accidentally turned on wrestling when looking for Saturday morning cartoons one day, and I saw Randy Savage dropping a double axe handle on somebody from the outside of the ring to the floor, and then dropping a flying elbow on them from the top turnbuckle back to the center of the ring. It was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. And from that point on, I was an unabashed Randy Savage fan. And that was it. It was Savage, period. That's what drew me into wrestling at the age of 6.
At the age of 6. Wow, that
And in Detroit, was it all mostly WWE after that? I guess the territory had probably all abated, gone away by then. So it's just WWE that you're mainly interested in at the time.
I didn't know who the original Sheik Ed Farhat was. I didn't know who Bobo Brazil was.
that was my next question. Did you know Bobo Brazil?
My dad who had never been to a wrestling event in his life knew who Dick the Bruiser was. They ran shows at the Olympia, and obviously he was very popular there. But no, it was essentially WWF territory. Period. I know Crockett Promotions made some effort to try to make some inroads into the Detroit market, but no, when I was growing up, in my mind, it was WWF or bust. I missed the original Four Horsemen era. I missed Georgia Championship Wrestling. I missed all of that. And so the funny story is when my Bahamian uncles, the one thing they knew about me, I didn't realize that I was so profusive with my talk of wrestling even back then. The one thing they knew about me for sure was that I was a pro wrestling fan. So when I went to visit them in 1989, Uncle David picked us up from Nassau Airport, drove us back to his house, and he said, "We're going to see wrestling." And I didn't know what a territory system was. I didn't know that wrestling existed outside of the WWF bubble, which I'm sure Gerald loves to hear. I'm sure Vince would have loved to hear that too. I didn't think wrestling existed outside of that bubble. So I'm thinking I'm going to be brought somewhere to see. I think I'm going to see a Savage. I think I'm going to see Hogan. I think um, who else was there at the time? I think the Killer Bees were wrapping up. That's who I was interested. Demolition. That's who I'm interested in seeing. And then my uncle says we're going to see Dusty Rhodes. I'm embarrassed to say I had no idea who Dusty Rhodes was. Uh, so he turns on the television, and I get to see a clip of Dusty. I get to see a clip of Terry Funk. This is Steve Keirn's Florida Championship Wrestling,
That's
or
what I was going to say. This had to be the independent Florida Championship Wrestling, away from Eddie Graham, right?
yeah, this is Steve Keirn's version. And so he brings me to I haven't been all around New Providence Island by this point. I don't know if they're hiding a huge stadium somewhere. So I'm walking down Bay Street with my uncle, expecting this huge stadium to
Oh, yeah.
emerge in the distance. And instead, we make a right turn, we go down the street, we walk into a restaurant, and then we walk through out to the back, and there's a ring set up in the middle of a courtyard. And that just blew my mind because, again, as Vince would have loved for me to think, you could only have wrestling in a huge arena like Joe Louis Arena or the Palace of Auburn Hills for me, or the Pontiac Silverdome. I didn't know you could just set up a ring in the middle of a courtyard and have wrestling. So I'm watching, and we've got Scotty Flamingo, who is Raven, and we've got Steve Keirn and Mike Graham wrestling on the show, and we've got the wrestlers. I'm sorry, we've got the Nasty Boys wrestling against Johnny Ace and the Terminator, who I think was another Laurinaitis brother. And then in the main event, in a Texas death match, we've got Dusty Rhodes against Big Steel Man, who is Fred Outman. And as it turned out, that was the one and only return trip Dusty would make to the Bahamas during that stint. And I think 2 weeks later, he was on his way to the WWF to wrestle in polka dots. And and shortly after that, he brought Ottman with him. But that's that was my education to the idea that wrestling could exist outside of the WWF. And from there, I wanted to learn everything I could about wrestling in general in the territories and especially wrestling in the Bahamas because I wanted to know how it got there, how long it had been going on, and everyone who had ever participated in it.
So this is a great little viewpoint here from a regular wrestling fan, a guy who becomes an author who's obviously very good at articulating his thoughts onto paper and to different people. What'd you think of Dusty when you first met him? Not when you first met him, when you first saw him. You first saw the great Dusty Rhodes. What were your thoughts?
So the first time I saw Dusty, I didn't get to hear him speak. So I was sort of taking my cues from the crowd. So you have the Nasty Boys coming out, and they briefly been in the AWA at this point, and you have the Nasty Boys coming out in front of an 85% Black Bahamian audience, and they are wildly over. And even then, I was thinking, wow, that's interesting. These guys are popular with the Bahamians. Okay, and then Tyree Pride comes out and I'm only 9 years old, and I'm thinking, who is this little guy? And the crowd is going nuts for him. So I'm like, oh, okay. Uh, and then Dusty comes out, and the place absolutely erupts. And I was like, okay, um, whatever it was that made him this popular here, the people just can't get enough of him. And you could see during the performance, like he's doing the flip flop and fly, he's strutting around, he's doing the facial gestures, he's appealing to the crowd, and I could see it. But I didn't get to hear Dusty talk until he arrived in the WWF, and then I was like, okay, I get it. Like the charisma, top to bottom, is
Wow.
undeniable.
Yeah.
Hey, and one thing that we were talking about before we got on air, and I want this brought up because this is such a good point because you knew the distance that it was. So when Mr. Eddie Graham was running the Bahamas and Mr. Briscoe was working for Mr. Graham down there, Mr. Lester Welch apparently got rolled a few times. He got robbed several times and lost the money every time they went to the Bahamas. But you have an exact distance that the parent apparently where he got robbed was like, you go ahead and finish it because this is one of the
Oh,
best stories I've ever.
Very
It's one of the
short.
best stories I've ever heard.
Well, it's a rough estimate, but it's only about 150 yards from the restaurant slash gym slash skating arena where it called Nassau Stadium, where these events are being held, to the Poop Deck restaurant, fantastic restaurant, where the
That is
wrestlers were hanging out afterwards, owned by Colin Lightbourne, and the wrestlers are also staying at Pilot House, small hotel about 400, 500 yards away from the Poop Deck, also owned by Colin Lightbourne. So it's not like they have this vast distance to traverse from the restaurant, from the matches to
and
the
it's wide
restaurant.
open there too. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not like it's
So there aren't a lot of corners like for burglars to hide behind, right, Jerry? Jump back, well, gotcha.
No, and the average Bahamian, especially in that era, is not exactly a giant. And if someone, and they know the people who are associated with wrestling, and if you attacked one of the wrestlers, a baby face at least, you're probably going to get jumped by the Bahamian fans. So there's no credence to the idea that he's getting mobbed by swarms of Bahamians who were stealing the cash box from him on the way from Nassau Stadium to the Poop Deck. There's no way.
And for those that are out there wondering, this is what it was: is Lester Welch would probably go down there, and then somehow the money would disappear and wouldn't make it back. But the guys were so happy to go to the Bahamas, they never really bitched about it. So somehow between Eddie Graham and Lester Welch, this money disappeared. Claimed that he was somehow robbed every single time in this 150-yard open field, and then but the boys didn't get their money,
Yeah.
and it happened
Bri-
repeatedly. So
Oh, Brian Blair told me he was absolutely furious. Apparently, this happened in back-to-back weeks
and it
where
did.
well, Mr. Briscoe was there too.
yeah, apparently this happened in back-to-back weeks. I forget who he was wrestling against, but this was the angle set up by the fact that I think it was Art Barr. Like, no, it wasn't Art Barr. It was set up by the fact that Brian wore a chicken costume and assaulted somebody in the ring. And so they have main event matches, back-to-back appearances. I think they were 2 weeks apart. And the first time, Nassau Stadium only holds about, I mean, if you were really pushing it, you could probably get 3,500 fans in there, and they pushed it regularly. And
Yeah,
and I go into
regularly.
this and I go into this detail in the book. Um, people like to say, "Oh, the poor Bahamian wrestling fans, they didn't have any money." They were paying probably 50% more than the most expensive tickets in Florida during that time to attend these shows. And this is in US dollars. It's 1 to 1. So they were going out of their way to support the product with their money. And so they would get 3,500 fans in there, and Brian's like, "Oh, I know I'm going to get paid tonight." And once again, Lester shows up, pulling his pockets inside out, essentially, like, "Sorry, lost it all."
And it
And
never
Jer-
happened on a half a house, John. It always happened on the full houses. You know, where you like Ian says, where you think you're going to get some payday there. But what a fantastic place to work. I mean, when Eddie was running over there, Jack and I would volunteer to go there because we're two Okies. We'd never seen the island before. Going over there and meeting the people, I love the people over there. It was just a dynamic place to work. They welcomed you with open arms. And if they like you in the Bahamas, man, you can go anywhere on that island and just about get whatever you wanted to get. So, everybody, why do you guys keep going over there? We wouldn't tell anybody. I wanted paradise or place one. Finally, we got Dusty to go over there. Dusty realized, man, this place is a dream place, and you can make pretty good money over there. It's all cash money, except when Lesser got rolled.
Yeah.
So,
Hey,
Mike Rotunda told me that going to the Bahamas was one of the best paydays of his life. When he and
wow.
Barry were the tag champions down there, he viewed it like it was this like he was getting a massive cash bonus every 2 weeks by going
And
down to
go
the
to
Bahamas.
paradise on top of it,
yeah. Hey,
And,
me and Ron
Exactly.
just went down there for, Mark Henry has a part in, I don't know how much part, but ownership stake in ACW Wrestling. And
Yep, All Caribbean
we were just
Wrestling.
in the Bahamas a few months ago. We had a great time. I mean, it was so much fun. They asked us, "You want to come to the Bahamas?" Wait a minute. The same thing that Mr. Brisco would say. You're going to pay us to come to the Bahamas? Yeah, the answer is yes.
Yeah, he's wrestling out of Baha Mar. He's got a pretty sweet setup down there.
That's right. He's got a great setup. Mark and them, they do a great job. Got great people down there. They do a wonderful job down there. Hey,
before
before
we
we
get
get
back
started,
to the
I do
book,
have to ask you one question because you wrote a book about Hornswoggle too, right? And
Yeah.
my lifelong goal is to hit him with trash cans. So you've given me a lifelong. You wrote a book about the person I have a lifelong goal about.
Well, if you show up at one of his shows in Appleton, you'll get your chance in
and
I
he
Appleton,
did,
did,
and
he
Texas.
did,
actually,
and he has.
I have.
Okay.
I've hit him a few times since. His son got me last time I was there in near Appleton. So
Yeah.
his son got
Yeah.
me back, but he hadn't got me back yet.
Yeah. Did his son hit you with a tadpole splash off the top turnbuckle?
No,
Because
he
he's
didn't, but
done that to guys from
he
time to
did get me
time.
with the trash can and
Okay.
landed on my nice new hat too. So I was a little upset about it.
Before we leave the Bahamas, there, before we came on air here, you were telling us an interesting story when the Bahama government decided, that no more mainland people. Kind of, I tell a story that I thought it was fascinating. How because I would think my brother and I were on the first show that we were able to go back there, and so.
Oh
If
yeah.
you would kind of just brief us on what happened there.
And
Oh
this is the book Bahamian Rhapsody for those people out there that want to get it. Bahamian Rhapsody.
yeah, correct. Well, it's no, it was not the best way to do business. And countries that tend to engage in this in the short term, they tend to suffer. But the idea is that the Bahamas had been under the colonial yoke of the British Empire for a long time. So when there is the popular when majority rule is what they called it in the Bahamas when the PLP took over the Bahamian government, and this is essentially the now the black government of the Bahamas under Lyndon Pindling. The idea is we need to ensure that as many jobs as possible go to Bahamians. Well, when it came to wrestling, and it's still very kayfabe, so the Bahamians think that wrestling is real, and you get editorials in the newspapers of Bahamians saying, well, wait, we have this American company coming here, and we have this American entity coming here and running shows, and we have no Bahamian wrestlers appearing on the shows. And so we need Bahamian wrestlers who can get an opportunity who can get an opportunity to wrestle. And uh, Eddie Eddie Graham had an office in Freeport,
Right.
Grand Bahama Island, which got its
And was
name
a
because
big property owner there also.
yeah, which got its name because it was a free port and it was a great place to keep your money because you weren't taxed on it. But the Bahamian government essentially pulled the work permits and pulled the business permits of Championship Wrestling from Florida. And Championship Wrestling from Florida got kicked off of the island, and it was replaced by what had essentially been a group of backyard wrestlers from the Bahamas, and that the first iteration of that failed fairly quickly. But what I'm sure Gerald wants me to allude to, the guy who started it, who I think was only 18, 19 years old at the time, he was a huge wrestling fan and a just a massive Jack Briscoe fan.
Mhm.
And so he wanted to emulate his hero, Jack Briscoe, and he started putting together a group of guys from the neighborhood, putting them through wrestling workouts as best they could, attempting to take bumps. And so they held the first all Bahamian wrestling show in, I think it was 1971 or 1972, but right after Championship Wrestling from Florida had first been booted off of the island. Now, the show wasn't very good. And so they started loosening the restrictions fairly quickly and allowing Championship Wrestling from Florida and other companies to return. But it is worth stating that Jack Briscoe was the inspiration to the wrestler who started the pro wrestling training movement in Nassau.
So,
That's awesome. And now, not to get in politics, but Herschel Walker is now the ambassador to the Bahamas, right?
Okay, so that's news to me.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, because they hadn't had an ambassador for years. It was a kind of a real negligence on the U.S. government's part. I'm not trying to get into politics, but a lot of our foreign stuff has not been taken care of, obviously, by Democrats or Republicans. But I think Herschel Walker was the one that ended up being the representative to go down there, the embassy guy.
Yeah, you look, you know better than I would. Um, uh, again, when I start writing at the pace I've been attempting to write, I go into a hole, I mark off the 1 hour a day and outside of my day job, and I just write. So my wife will come and tell me, hey, when she comes home from work, did you hear about this? Did you hear about that? The answer is always no, because I just haven't been paying attention to the news like a responsible citizen should.
so as a
Yeah, I
9 year
just
old,
I just Googled it. Former running back Herschel Walker picked as Bahamas ambassador December 18th, 2024. So I guess that I don't know if it's gone through or not yet, but
Yeah,
we got
well, you're
Herschel
breaking
down there.
see
you're
what kind of
breaking news to
educational
me.
show we are in. I mean,
That's right.
we aim to educate everybody.
Well, I
So
know
as
it
a
Hey,
because
nine,
I know it because Ron keeps up with Herschel. And
okay.
Ron mentioned that to me last week. He goes, "Yeah, Herschel's going straight." And I acted like I knew what I was talking about, but I had to go Google it and then found out Herschel is.
Hey, I appreciate it. I teach you something, you teach me something. It's quid pro quo here.
so you
Exactly.
come back to the states. You know, you're 9 years old. You got your first taste of professional wrestling, and then let's fast forward a little bit. Northwestern University, you're a journalism major at one of the most prestigious universities in the United States, and as you're there, did you show a passion for professional wrestling writing at that time, or what was it?
Oh, brother. Okay, so um at the time, I don't know how Northwestern University feels about me now. Even though they don't mind giving some promotion to my books when they come out. They don't mind advertising that I'm a Webby Award winner, which just happened earlier this year. I mean,
Congratulations.
thank you. I had very little to do with it, but I'll gladly accept the trophy since they gave me one. Um, but while I was there, every every opportunity I had, I wrote about something wrestling related. So Northwestern has what's known as the Medill News Service. And I actually think it's a pretty nice scam that they had going there that was definitely cooked up by somebody in the MBA program, where we're paying a huge amount in tuition, and Northwestern has us in their downtown newsroom and we're writing news articles all day and they um the Chicago Southtown, the Northwest Indiana Times, the Chicago Defender, they're paying Northwestern to funnel to funnel breaking news in their direction. And we're all paying tuition to Northwestern for the right to write those articles and get the news clips in those publications. So Medill was getting paid by absolutely everybody to churn all of this news information out of us. But okay, so
And they wonder
with
why journalism is dead.
yeah. But to answer your question, when we were writing about when we were writing about business, I managed to get I managed to get the opportunity to write about the business of sports. And I remember shamelessly going to the editor and saying, "Hey, does wrestling count?" And he said, "Oh, absolutely." I said, "Wonderful." So I go to a Windy City wrestling event, say, "Hey, I'm a writer for the Medill News Service. I'd like to come to your show." And I'm told, "Sure." So I go to the event, and Larry Zabisco is outside smoking a cigarette as soon as I pull up. So I get to meet him. I go inside. That's one of the events where AJ Styles and Christopher Daniels and Abyss were all working as special talent. So I got to go in and meet them. This is 2005. I got to make the acquaintance of several of the wrestlers. So then when we get to the broadcast portion of the program, I actually dedicate my 5 minute feature. I get to anchor the show itself, the Medill Report show, which is an honor. But my 5 minute segment of the program is a feature that's dedicated to Jasmine Jones, Acid Jazz, an indie wrestler in Chicago at the time, who is a Chicago school teacher by day and an indie pro wrestler by night. So that was fun. And also, and again, when reporting on the business of wrestling, uh, I asked if I could oh, I don't even see how this neatly aligned with the business requirement, but Windy City Pro Wrestling had its Black Pro Wrestling Urban League going on at the time. So I was able to go to one of those shows and interview all of the wrestlers there about what their aspirations were with respect to wrestling, how they weren't getting paid anything, but it didn't matter. And that got feature placement in the Chicago Defender, which was fantastic. So to answer your question, Gerald, um, Northwestern was more accepting than I thought they would be about my proclivity to attend wrestling events and my desire to write about them.
Awesome.
And then when you get out, that's is that when you first decided to start writing about different biographies? I mean, you've written a ton of these wrestling biographies.
Yeah. So what happened there was I start I start off as an NBC news reporter in Flint, Michigan, and very shortly transitioned out of that into Michigan state government, working for Andy Dillon, who was the Speaker of the House, and then he was the state treasurer. got himself embroiled in the Flint water crisis. I was not there at the time while that was going on.
A
But I,
politician in a crisis? That's the first I've ever heard of that.
right. I was one of his deputy press secretaries. I transitioned out of there, started working in business, primarily fitness equipment. While I was working in that space, I was attending events like the Arnold Classic. I met Kurt Angle there and got to be pretty cool with him. So I got to take the bus out to Pittsburgh, hang out with Kurt Angle in his house. This was shortly after Giovanna had their first kid. So I'm filming Kurt in his home gym and interviewing him. And Giovanna's upstairs making cupcakes and hands me one while I'm waiting for my ride, which I still appreciate. But I get to meet Kurt, and years later, when I was writing for the marketing team of Mavoto Real Estate out in San Mateo, California, we have our blog, and um, it was one of those BuzzFeed type things. But I wanted to do an article on the 10 best places to wrestle. Kurt Angle and I are cool, so I just call him up and say, "Hey, can I interview you real quick on the 10 best cities to wrestle in?" He said, "Yes, absolutely." I start using that as leverage to get other people to talk to me. Like, hey, I'm Ian Douglas from Mavoto. You don't know who I am, but I've got this article I did with Kurt Angle. And I don't say this, but the implication is if I'm good enough for Kurt Angle, I
Of
should be
course.
good
Right.
enough for
Of course.
you. You should let me interview you. I leave Mavoto, start writing for the State Games of Michigan. I do the same thing. I interview Kurt Angle about wrestling and I interview him about his workouts because all of this is sports based. Then I use that as leverage. I go to Dallas Page, like, hey, DDP, let's talk about the benefits of yoga. And then I go to Taz, like, Taz, talk to me about judo. And then I go to Dan Severn, Michigan guy, and start talking to him about combat sports training. Severn, I only needed 20 minutes from him. He talks to me for an hour and a half. And I said, I logged it away in my brain. You know, if I got an hour and a half out of him so easily, if I could get 10 to 15 conversations going with him like that, this would be book length. And Dan kept texting and calling me after that, primarily because my cousin was one of the co-founders and co-owners of the Dark Horse Brewing Company in Marshall, Michigan, which was a stone's throw away from Coldwater. Dark Horse Brewing Company briefly had its own reality series on the History Channel, of all things. But when Dan found that out, he kept hitting me up asking, like, hey, do you think Dark Horse wants to do anything to co-promote with me? And I said, like, Dan, I don't think you're their thing. Like, my cousins are hardcore Slayer fans. Like, everything they do is heavy metal. I don't think you quite fit that image. But he mentioned to me that he wanted to release a book. And that's when I told him, like, hey, I think if you give me 2 weeks worth of your time, an hour to an hour and a half a day, I think we can get a book released. And that's what happened. And that's how we got Dan Severn's autobiography released. And um, I don't think I did a very good job with it. It was my first attempt. And in a lot of cases, I mean, you can tell me if I'm off base, but I'm assuming the first time you had a wrestling match, you were really nervous and you were dying for it to be over with. And it's only once you get through the first one, you're probably thinking, you know what, if I spent a little more time with this and maybe I tweaked this and maybe I threw a little more in here, if I get a little more comfortable, and I'll be a little more comfortable next time, and I think it will be a better effort. And that's what happened with Dan's book. And so the next time around, it was a little better. And I think I really started to get a firm handle on what I was doing by the time I did Bugsy McGraw's book.
What was the biggest thing you learned from doing Dan's book? What was the thing that you would have changed?
Um, so several things. The first thing was in my mind at the time, I needed to hit on the things that I perceived that fans would care about. And I put myself into the shoes of the average fan. Like, okay, I want to hear about your fights with Ken Shamrock. I want to hear about your training for Ken Shamrock. I want to hear about how you changed up your training tactics from your first UFC appearance to your second, now that you really have a handle on what MMA is. I want to hear about training with Al Snow. I want to hear about your experience as an NWA champion in like a now that the NWA is a glorified indie. I want to hear about the Brawl for All. So in my mind, I'm thinking about Dan's career as this sequence of events that are important to me from the standpoint of being a wrestling fan and MMA fan. And I'm thinking quick introduction. Let's get to the wrestling and the MMA as fast as we can because that's what fans care about. And once we're done with that, let's get out. So, that's why it's a 200 and I think 70 page book. And I learned later on, like there was no need to rush. There was no need to rush my way through it. Um, and it's really important to get to know the individual and everything that was going on in their family life early on and what caused them to develop into the person they became. And it's a far more engaging experience the more you know about the person you're covering. And that's why once you get past Bugsy's book and get to Brian's, everything I've worked on is 400 plus pages, and in Kern's case, 2 volumes of 400 plus pages.
Right, and it's all about the expanding of the character,
It,
essentially, instead of just this the old storytelling is what it is.
Yeah.
exactly, and also, you know, I would dare to say that I've become very good friends with Brian Blair and Steve Kern and Mike Rotunda through the process of taking my time to work on their books. In Steve's case, like we're going to talk once a week for a year. So we have plenty of time to get into whatever material is important to you, because as one of my journalism professors at Northwestern told me once, if it's important to you, it will be important to somebody else. Well, if it's important to Steve, then it's probably important that I get this down. So I would approach Steve, and I may have a page full of notes. Um, I may have a page full of notes written up of things I wanted to talk about. And then Steve would say, you know what? My good friend just died. I want to talk about it. I'd say, okay, let's talk about it. Like, oh, open up. Let's hear it. Because like that's when you really get into the mindset of somebody who's been involved in an entertainment sport with an attrition rate that is sky high, who's watched so many of his friends pass away over the years. And I think that's one of the best thing about Kern's books is that he's just so vulnerable in that regard, and he's really letting the emotions flow. Like especially book 2, where he's a guy who wanted to retire from wrestling in 1988, and due to what he perceives to be personal and professional failures, he couldn't do that. And I think the fact that he was willing to go into such depth with respect to that and also the losses he suffered in terms of his friends over that period of time really gives that second book its heart.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about, developing the person themselves, which obviously I agree, it's just storytelling. How do you do a book like this, a decided novelty that just came out? Because when you're talking about one of the first Black Sam, they called it back in the 1880s.
Yeah.
Vero Small. Yeah, Vero
Vero
Black Sam
Small.
Small.
Very
Black
Black
Sam.
Sam Small.
Yeah. you don't have the ability to interview him. You don't have any ability to interview probably anybody alive that knew him. So how do you get into that character development with these guys? Is it just all research of newspapers and trying to find things on these people?
It's research of newspapers, but it's also understanding the events that are unfolding at the time. And also just I like to insert anecdotes that really give people a sense of the passage of time, the passage of time, like who the presidents were at the time, that what the music tastes were at the time,
Sure.
what the lay of the land was in terms of professional sports at the time. Because when you start talking about, I think I mentioned this in the notes that I passed along to you guys. There was this there even back in the earliest stages of pro wrestling, with when a guy like Gus Sonnenberg enters wrestling in the 1920s, he's a guy with a professional football background, and he's an NFL champ, a very early NFL champion, and he's able to leverage that into tremendous popularity wherever he goes. He's a special attraction. Black wrestlers don't even get that opportunity until Woody Strode is wrestling in the 1940s. He was one of the wrestlers who breaks the NFL color barrier and doesn't last very long in the NFL. He ends up a star in the Canadian Football League. And then of course he goes on to wrestle and act and then becomes a full-time actor. But um, Black wrestlers didn't have the ability to really enter professional sports outside of boxing. And even then, their opportunities were limited on the highest levels. But because there was this understanding that black athletes could box, and that was really the only professional sports outlet they had, almost every single black wrestler from the 1930s onward, the promoters are presenting them as if they have this deep background in boxing because you couldn't even fake a football background for them because they weren't allowed to play football.
Right.
Wow.
Did it go in different portions as far as acceptability? Like so, like after the Civil War, nobody expected Lincoln to be assassinated. All of a sudden, Andrew Johnson comes in and sets the civil rights movement back till Lyndon Johnson, but sets it back 100 years. Then you have like Woodrow Wilson, Birth of the Nation. The Klan gets this reboot and all this stuff, and then you have Kennesaw and all these horrible people. Was there different times in from the 1880s to 1950s that you write about that there were blacks were more accepted in wrestling than others?
Well, absolutely yes, and it's very regionally distinct. You have cases where you have black wrestlers who are performing in front of black audiences. You have cases where they're performing in front of audiences that are presumably 100% white. And you also have to keep in mind that the the newspapers are almost completely segregated at the time as well. And so you have writings that are shocking to modern sensibilities when it comes to how the black wrestlers are described and also how they're promoted. You have Jack Claiborne in Oregon, and Oregon is interesting for several reasons. But Jack Claiborne in Oregon is presented as if he's a byproduct of a Little Moe's comic strip. And Claiborne, as far as I can tell, is probably one of the best natural athletes in wrestling history, from everything I can glean. And you have promoter, I mean, a last name that people are going to recognize out there, Herb Owen out in Portland.
Now, when I read that name, is he related to the
Absolutely.
Elton Owens and
A-
Don Owens? Yeah.
Absolutely. You have Herb Owen, who sort of is testing the waters by seeing if he can get Claiborne into a main event out in Oregon. And the way he does it is by is by suggesting that the heel wrestlers are racist and don't want Jack Claiborne to get into the Battle Royal. So Claiborne works his way into the Battle Royal, gets a few victories in the Battle Royal, and loses, but it ends up being he ends up being such a popular attraction that he ends up getting a main event match in Portland the following week. A funny side note to that is that Claiborne is he's called a giant by the standards of the time. This is the Great Depression. You didn't have many true heavyweights. At the time, he was probably 6'1", 170, extremely lean. And he's a guy who would throw a dozen drop kicks a night on in what was essentially a boxing ring, a very stiff mat. So he's throwing a dozen drop kicks a night, and you have the sports editor, the sports editors in the Oregonian, I believe it is, drafts an editorial where he says that Jack Claiborne is going to kill the wrestling business because of all the drop kicks he's throwing. He's exposing the business, and this is and the modern wrestling of 1935 is a far cry from what it was in the previous era where guys just grappled and rolled around on the mat. So, I mean, that also demonstrates that it's been a constant complaint from one era to the next, even beginning in the 1930s, that whatever changes or innovations are being made, that these guys are exposing and ruining the business.
Now, you're saying that now, were the black wrestlers, were they some of the first to do the aerial type moves and things like that, or you know?
Probably not. Claiborne was probably one of the first guys because he eventually bulks up and he ends up in the legitimate 6'1", 220, 230 range throwing drop kicks. And you can look it up on YouTube. I think the only footage of Claiborne that exists is a 1 minute match clip from Australia in 1950 or 1951. So you've got 41-year-old Jack Claiborne. He's clearly broken down, clearly overweight, and he's standing flat-footed, throwing drop kicks to the chin of a guy who's 6'3". And this is again after almost 20 years of night after night throwing a dozen drop kicks and taking stiff landings. But yes, he's one of the first aerialists, and even in this 1951 performance, you can see him doing the monkey flip, popping to his feet and doing the toe touch, and you're like, wait a second, that's Carlos Colon in Puerto Rico in 1982.
Right, yeah.
Claiborne's doing it in 1951. Claiborne had stopped doing front flips by 1951 because, again, he's broken down. But you get the California newspapers, and this was particularly galling. And this is one of those things where I'm doing the research, and I'm getting offended reading it, and then as I'm going through and progressing through, I see the sports writers of the era correcting it in real time, which was a relief to me. Claiborne comes back from a 1 year reign as the champion of Hawaii in 1949, which is a landmark. No black wrestler had had a territorial reign touching that up until that point. He comes back from
Hey, just to go back to that, I heard you do an interview about that. That's really interesting to me. The territory there, I didn't realize they had such a big territory there, way before Peter Maivia, right?
Yes,
And
yeah.
they had a territory there, and he was the champion there for a year. That's pretty groundbreaking, right?
Yeah, Al Karasik. So when you start, and I want to make sure I get back to touching on to addressing the Claiborne thing in
Sure.
California after that, but when you go through that period of time, you have Joseph. Okay, you have Clarence Bolden, who is black, half black, who is multi-weight class world champion who Frank Gotch, who doesn't know that Bolden is half black, is referring to as pound for pound the best wrestler in the world at the
Frank
time,
Gotch,
which
Frank
is yeah,
Gotch.
Frank
Yeah,
Gotch,
Wow.
which is fascinating.
yeah,
Um, and then Bolden starts to rest on his laurels, loses in a pretty scandalous match in Cleveland, loses his championship, ends up getting injured and retires from wrestling, joins the road commission, becomes a police officer, uh, and gets married, dies in the 1960s. He dies with the majority of people not knowing that he's half black, which is in and of itself fascinating. Um,
yeah.
And
That's
full criminal,
unbelievable.
by the way. He had a criminal past.
Yes,
Yeah.
he had a criminal past in Missouri. He was married to his black wife. He bolts in,
So he left the criminal past, his black life, everything behind,
absconds to Cleveland and
and
starts
becomes
train.
a white innocent citizen.
Exactly, you got it.
I love
But
it.
he's a legitimate, because we generally view that era as being relatively legit. He's a legit multi-weight division world champion, pound for pound best in the world. Lives, retires, lives, wrestles, retires, dies. Nobody knows he's half black. So after that, you get Joseph Alvin Godfrey wrestling for Charlie Gordon as Ed Flowers. Later, he goes to New York and becomes Tiger Flowers. But he's wrestling for Charlie Gordon in Massachusetts. And in his debut year, he's the world middleweight champion as recognized in Massachusetts. And later, he goes to Detroit, adopts the identity of Rufus Jones, the original Rufus Jones, and wrestles under that title until he dies in 1951 and never sniffs another championship for the next 18 years of his career after that first year. Uh, and you get so he has like a 1 to 2 month reign with a championship. You get Sealy Samara in Boston, who's a champion, even though he never wins the title in the ring. He's a champion for a couple of months until that title is just phased out in favor of Steve Crusher Casey. You get Samara later on with a 5 month reign in the Pacific Northwest, which is the reign that really establishes him. Like he lives on that reign for the rest of his career because he gets to defeat Tillet, the French Angel, pretty convincingly a few times, and that becomes his calling card. That's a 5 month reign in I think it was 1947. I'm not counting Jim Mitchell's reign as the champion of Sandusky, Ohio. Others might. That lasted for like
Yeah,
a couple months.
yeah.
And then you get Reginald Seekey shortly before he dies with a 3 month title reign when he's 50 years old as
Wow.
As the California state champion. So those are the major title reigns over the course of almost 50 years until you get to Jack Claiborne and he's wrestling for Al Karasik in Hawaii and he gets to hold the championship for a full year. Then he goes back to California and the California promoters seem to agree that they're going to bury the fact that Claiborne was a year-long title holder in Hawaii because they don't want to build that expectation. And because Antonino Rocca, who's 10 years younger than Claiborne with 15 fewer years of ring experience, he starts doing the heavyweight high flying thing. The California promoters start to advertise Jack Claiborne. Oh, well, he's the black Antonino Rocca. And as I'm reading this and I'm getting annoyed. And then in real time, you get sports writers who were saying, no, Claiborne's been doing this for 20 years. He was doing this before Roca knew what a wrestling ring was. And in effect, Antonina Roca is the white Jack Claiborne, which was a relief to see.
Wow. Ian, but how did these guys, or why? My question is why, like Clarence Bolden, Missouri guy, and all of a sudden he's the Cuban Wonder. Then you come up with these Black Panther nicknames. Was that to get away from the segregation, or what was that all about?
Oh, yeah. So Bolden doesn't end up with the Black Panther nickname. It was Illa Vincent who first ends up with the Black Panther nickname. But
Bolden was a Cuban Wonder, right?
yeah, Bolden was the Cuban Wonder, but Illa Vincent, when he first comes in, here's where you get into the territory of there being rumors regarding Bolden's background.
Okay.
Because when Illa Vincent
This
shows
bold is great. I just think this is the
Yeah, yeah,
greatest thing
I
ever.
do too.
I just love this.
Yeah, when Illa Vincent shows up in the teens, people start saying, well, he's Cuban, and he's Cuban, and the Cuban who preceded him was was Clarence Bolden. Well, in truth, neither one of these guys was Cuban. And then they're also saying, well, Vincent is Negro, and this is a separate publication saying Vincent is Negro, and the Negro wrestler who preceded him was Clarence Bolden, and this is, of course, a decade after Bolden retired, and this doesn't gain any traction. So you sort of have these pockets that know that Bolden was at least part black. But the funniest one was on the eve of Bolden winning the light heavyweight championship. You have these people out east who are saying that Bolden is a full-blooded Negro. And no one who ever laid eyes on him would ever have said that. It's absolutely preposterous. In
Wow.
fact, even when he's being arrested in Kansas City in the late 1890s, the newspapers even say like he and his brother were mistaken for white men during the actual robberies.
Wow.
What did he rob?
I think it was just a convenience store.
Wow. And these guys are getting top matches. I mean, he's in the ring with Frank Gotch, and he defeats Frank Gotch. And I mean, how did the crowd accept him during that time?
Oh, well, at the time, again, they think he's you know, I don't know how Cubans were necessarily perceived in the early 1900s, but he was a light-skinned Cuban. And it was a Cleveland crowd. He was Cleveland's adopted son, and they absolutely ate that up.
Mhm.
They adored him.
While we mention Cuba, I want to digress for just a minute and go to a complete something that non sequitur here and go to Cuba. In 1915, Jack Johnson, Jess Willard, was promoted by Jess McMahon, who was Vince McMahon, the current Vince McMahon, his grandfather. There
Mhm.
was questions in the 26th round if Jack Johnson threw the fight. He's laying on the mat, and it could be a reflex out of being knocked out, but he put his glove up to shield his eyes from the hot sun. A lot of people think that Jack Johnson threw the fight on to Jess Willard, and being a McMahon as the promoter kind of leads credence a little bit that something nefarious might have happened. Do you have? I've asked everybody who comes on that has any knowledge about this time of history. Do you have any feeling, any intuition, any info about was this a work or a shoot?
None. But I could tell you, I mean, George Godfrey, I mean, and this is about 10 to 15 years later, but George Godfrey, who's in a similar position to Jack Johnson and is trying to maximize his earning potential, there are several instances of him throwing fights. And, again, nothing speaks louder than a dollar. So if there was money to be made, I wouldn't be surprised if Jack Johnson took a dive. And it's funny that you should mention Jack Johnson because I mentioned it several times in the book. Johnson was apparently a pretty huge wrestling fan.
Really?
He shows up to support Illa Vincent when Illa Vincent is a top draw at the Pekin Theater in Chicago. Um, he shows up to support Illa Vincent and puts money on him to win his matches. And then 10 years later, when Lee Umbles is a is a draw, not as big a draw as Vincent, but is a draw in the lower weight classes in Chicago, Jack Johnson also shows up and voices his support for Umbles. So, yeah, Johnson was apparently quite the pro wrestling fan.
There was a lot of crossover between the boxing champs, I guess just arenas and training and things like that between the boxing champs, especially, and the wrestling champs, right?
Oh, tons. You end up with, so Jack Claiborne definitely had a boxing background, although every indication was he wasn't very good at it. Uh, you have King Kong Clayton, Leroy Clayton, who was a very accomplished boxer who cleaned up in the southern states before he moves out to Los Angeles, and he's promoted as this next great thing, and almost immediately gets knocked out. And his boxing career is, for all intents and purposes, finished. He very quickly migrates over to professional wrestling, ends up in Montana and Alberta, and becomes a massive draw and starts boxing again. So King Kong Clayton goes out there, wins several fights in Calgary, in Edmonton and Calgary primarily, then gets knocked out again, decides he's done with boxing, then moves on to California, starts wrestling there again, comes back to the Midwest, and joins up with what I refer to as the murderer's row of black wrestling in the era, which is the Black Panther, Jim Mitchell, Rufus Jones, Celie Samara, and Jack Claiborne, and starts having engagements with them before he gets drafted into the U.S. Army and he's gone for World War II.
And one thing you did was you're the one that figured out that Tiger Flowers and Rufus Jones was the same person, right?
Yeah, that was a nice little Easter egg. And I think that speaks to the importance and the necessity of covering this as a cohesive topic. And I'm as much to blame for this as anyone. So when you hear me being critical, I'm not pointing fingers outward. I'm also pointing them inward. I think there is a tendency for wrestling publications when Black History Month is rolling around, they're saying, okay, who can we cover? What new wrinkle can we unearth? And they'll start covering black wrestlers, and I'm talking about myself, will start heaping commendations on people for being the first to do this, or probably one of the first to do this, and we're just guessing. We don't know. And that's why I started going through, and I'm going to take my time, take a look at everybody's career from start to finish and really try to figure this out. And when you get to Joseph Alvin Godfrey, you learn that first he's wrestling as Ed Flowers. He's the world champion. And then he briefly, when he switches promoters, he wrestles under his name Joe Godfrey for like a month. And then he heads on to New York, where he becomes Tiger Flowers Johnstone, poses for the famous bust, and you can tell by the cauliflower ear of the bust that it's him.
That's the
And
one in Harvard, right?
that's the one at the Harvard Museums. Emily Winthrop Miles was the sculptress. And then he goes on to Detroit. He wrestles as Rufus Jones, and then he's primarily in the Midwest wrestling as Rufus Jones, and also in Ontario for many years. But uh, the funny, as I'm researching this, I'd already covered the Rufus Jones stuff. And I said, well, let me look at Tiger Flowers. And you see a handful of times where he pops up for these matches in Maine or New Brunswick or briefly in Montreal. And I take a look at the promo photos and I'm like, that's Rufus Jones. Like, why is Tiger Flowers using Rufus Jones promo photos? And then I start looking at the timeline. Like, that's interesting. Rufus Jones disappears for 2 months, and during that 2-month period, Tiger Flowers pops up in Maine. That's interesting. And then I'm tracking like, huh, during this week where Sealy Samara and Rufus Jones are wrestling in Michigan and parts of Ontario. They have the night off, but Tiger Flowers and Zelis Amhara pop up in a show in Montreal. And then they disappear, and then Samara and Jones pop up again. It's like, okay, that's very interesting. And then the other two things. First, I flat out find a a very brief clip in one of the Ontario publications that flat out says Rufus Jones is off wrestling in the Maritimes where he plies his trade under the name Tiger Flowers. And I'm like, okay, well,
Okay.
well, that's pretty convincing. And and then when he finally gets down to Cincinnati, when Jones finally starts wrestling down in Cincinnati, he starts talking about how Ted Germain is the guy who taught him how to wrestle and how he won the world middleweight champion. He became so good that he won the world middleweight championship from Ted Germain, and he only abandoned it once he moved up in weight, which is not true. He only held it for 2 months. But that was intriguing because I was like, huh, there are no example like Ted Germain never wrestled like west of the western border of Massachusetts, as far as I can tell. His name means absolutely nothing to the people of Cincinnati. There's no reason to bring that up unless there's some truth to it. And it's at that point that I go and start looking for instances where there might be a Flowers wrestling prior to New York 1934, and that's when I find the Black Panther Ed Flowers wrestling in Massachusetts in 1933, and he's the world middleweight champion wrestling against Ted Germain. But
Why did he have so many different names? There had
well,
to be a strategic reason, or was there?
Well, John, it's like who was it on a big winning streak, and then they did research and they found out most of his wins were against the same guy who used different names there. You remember who that was?
It was Gus Sonnenberg.
Yes, John. Yeah,
Gus
Gus
Sonnenberg, yeah.
Son. Yeah.
yeah, well, in the Tiger Flowers case, so there was a pretty significant promotional war going on in Massachusetts at the time, primarily by Charlie Gordon and Paul Bowser in the Boston area, but it was also broken up by region, which is why George George Hardison, who wrestled as the Black Demon, George Hardison, is wrestling in Western Massachusetts under that name, pops into Boston to wrestle as Sealy Samara, and then he heads back to Western Massachusetts and he's wrestling as George Hardison again. So there's even in a pre-WWE trademarking of the names era, there seemed to be this understanding that your name was at least in part owned by the promoter,
Right.
which is why you have Ed Flowers, you have Ed Flowers wrestling in Boston, and then you have Joe Godfrey wrestling in Lynn, and then you have Tiger Flowers Johnston wrestling in New York, and then you have Rufus Jones wrestling in the Midwest, and and also why you have a different promoter when Bowser's competing against Charlie Gordon. You also have a different promoter bringing in his own Tiger Flowers because Tiger Flowers is not an original wrestling name. That was the name of Ted Tiger Flowers, who was one of the first black wrestling world champions in the 1920s, died tragically during surgery on his eyes. And as a tribute to him, you had at least a dozen black boxers who adopted the name Tiger Flowers, just as you had at least a dozen black boxers adopting the name the Black Panther. And so Tiger Flowers as a name in both boxing and wrestling was practically public domain, which would also be an incentive once Godfrey relocates to Michigan to change his name to Rufus Jones.
Right.
Which coincidentally, after he dies, you also have obvious cases of wrestlers picking up the name Rufus Jones and running with it.
Rufus Ordo just
Teddy Long's dog.
now,
Teddy Long's dog is named Mr. Rufus, by the way. He is. So me
Yeah.
and Ron Simmons used to call him Teddy Rufus Long, always.
there you
I
go.
mean, I don't worry. Anyway, we called him that so much. Teddy's got this wonderful dog. He sends me pictures and videos all the time, which I love because I love animals. And it's his dog's name is Mr. Rufus. He got this beautiful rescue dog that he sends me videos all the time. So I am very happy every time he sends me a picture of that dog.
Well,
So
now
the
I'm wishing,
name Rufus is alive and well today.
well, now you have me wishing I let Basil into the room for the interview, but I kicked her out. I'll send you a photo.
And a lot of these world champions were they separate? Were they, I mean, were they known as Black World Championships, or were they United World Championships? I'm curious on that, how they were promoted.
Oh, okay. So what I repeatedly use the term race neutral to differentiate between titles in the era because for the most part, the guys were brought in as colored world champion or Negro world champion,
Negro World
and it was, and I mean that varied from territory to territory. The weight class that they wrestled in could vary from territory to territory. You tend to find that pre World War II era during the Great Depression, especially as wrestling was more aligned with boxing, you have way more of the top titles being light heavyweight and middleweight championships because frankly it was hard to put on weight during an era where a lot of people were starving. And so the majority of the wrestlers, even the heaviest guys, are showing up at around 170, 180. And so you have a lot of world middleweight and world light heavyweight championships in a lot of cases where that's the top title in every region. In fact, you have Al Karasik, whose Hawaiian championship, the only championship he promoted, was a light heavyweight championship up until I think the mid 1950s. There's an interview where he says that the two things that he considered to be fads in the sport of wrestling were wrestlers who were exceedingly large and heavy, and also women wrestling. And that what people were really interested in seeing were skilled wrestlers who they could relate to, who were in the lower weight divisions. And that's why he had his light heavyweight championship. But as far as the titles went, the first case of a black wrestling championship belt I could find was held by Roosevelt Reed, who went by the name Tiger Jack Nelson most popularly. When he first started wrestling, he was the Black Panther of Memphis, Jack Nelson, and he introduces his black world championship belt in Ontario. And he claims that he won it during a tournament of all black wrestlers in Toledo, Ohio. And the only case I can find of him defending that championship, the two cases of him defending a championship against another black wrestler. The first is against Gorilla Parker, Henry Daniels of Oklahoma, where he gets trounced by Gorilla Parker. And the other example I can find of that is what seems to be his retirement match against George Godfrey in California, just as World War II is kicking off, and that's it. But that championship had so many different names over the years, varying by region, varying by weight division, and in the book, it would be a footnote, if not for the fact that when Sam Mushnick breaks away from Tom Pax and starts promoting wrestling, he decides to bring he decides to make black wrestling matches a feature of his shows. He brings in Celie Samara again and King Kong Clayton as one of his featured attractions. And prior to the event, they give an interview saying there's going to be a tournament to determine the true black world champion. The prior holder of the belt was Tiger Jack Nelson. The tournament never reaches a conclusion, but the semifinal winners were Jack Claiborne and Celie Samara. And then several years later in Los Angeles, Claiborne and Samara wrestle with Claiborne and Samara wrestle with Samara entering the bout as the champion. And the physical belt has on it that the prior champions, the prior holders of the belt, were Jack Nelson and Rufus Jones. This is completely fictitious, but these guys seem to honor and recognize Jack Nelson as their inspiration as the black title holder. And Rufus Jones just happens to be the guy that Claiborne defeated in St. Louis during what was his semifinal bout of the tournament. And for the remainder of his career, as long as Claiborne has the belt, because it's his personal property, he claims that it's sanctioned by the New York State Athletic Commission, which it wasn't, and it probably got him in hot water. But he also claims in interviews that the two prior holders of the belt were Jack Nelson and Rufus Jones. So that ends up being, so that's really the history of that championship. And what isn't covered in this book, but what is covered in the Jack Claiborne Rufus Jones book, is the fact that Claiborne ends up becoming one of the first and most obvious cases of a National Wrestling Alliance boycott. He does something to upset Al Karasik in Hawaii. He leaves prior to one of his bouts, and Karasik goes to the press the next day. He says Claiborne skipped out on his match. He was not authorized to do so, and he is probably going to have difficulty finding employment as a wrestler due to the reach of the National Wrestling Alliance. And as you see, uh, as he attempts to establish some momentum over the next 3 years in the established NWA territories, all of a sudden the Illinois State Athletic Commission says that Claiborne is banned for life. And the Michigan Athletic Commission says he's banned. And the New York State Athletic Commission says he's banned. And the Pennsylvania Athletic Commission says he's banned. And the Missouri Athletic Commission says he's banned. As he's touring primarily with Buddy Jackson as the Negro World Heavyweight Champion, so that he has a partner with him, so that he can offer, depending on the promoter he's working for, he can offer a Negro World Heavyweight Championship bout on whatever card he appears on. Or if the promoter would prefer that they present the two black wrestlers as a tag team, he and Buddy Jackson can wrestle as the Negro tag team champions, but it's not an authentic title. You did not get Negro. I need to be careful as I'm saying it. You did not get black tag team champions until after the death of Rufus Jones, when Don Kindred and Frank James are brought into the Northwest almost as a Rufus Jones tribute act. Like they're headbutting everybody in sight, and they win and unify the Rocky Mountain and Pacific Northwest Tag Team Championships, and they're known by the name the Brown Bombers. That's in 1953. And then Jack Claiborne and Luther Lindsay, who's the newcomer, they team up in Canada and they win the Canadian Heavyweight Tag Team Championships. And they're the first babyface black tag team to hold the titles, and that's in 1954. Right after Claiborne gets kicked out of New York as an action of the New York State Athletic Commission.
Those confessions
Are
are
there
so
any of
crooked.
the black championship belts still in existence, or have they all disappeared?
They've disappeared. There are pictures of Claiborne with his championship belt. There is a very clear image, fortunately, and it's in the book. There's a very clear image of Tiger Jack Nelson and his Black World Championship belt. And fortunately, that's been preserved, and that's in the book.
Was there any time that you had before the say 1950 or before? Did you have white versus black for the what was considered the Universal Championship? So like Londos or Stranglos Lou or Daniel Mahoney or any of those guys, did they ever defend the title against a black wrestler?
Yeah, Celie Samara in the Midwest, in both the pre-NWA, uh, the pre-NWA version of the NWA title, and once the NWA became an official, the entity that we know it to be. Celie Samara had multiple championship matches against NWA champions.
So there was because like Sweet Daddy Siki. The reason I asked that Sweet Daddy Siki, down in Carolinas, they say the Klan lined up and said, "Don't we can't have a black versus a white world championship match because we can't afford for a black to win the title." But there was at times, I guess it depended on where you were in the country that you had some the interracial championship matches.
Oh, sure. You don't get any of that in the southern states during the time period we're covering. It's primarily Don Blackman, and Don Kindred, who are heading down into Virginia first, who are offering a black wrestler versus black wrestler, a legitimate match, because this would be a place where they would have had unskilled black wrestler battle royals. They're the first pair presenting this as a legitimate bout, and it packs the balcony with black fans and the main arena floor with white fans, and the promoters are figuring out, hey, this is a way for us to make some serious money with the black fans that we've been ignoring for so many years. And then Jim Crockett Sr. goes to Don Blackman and wants him to come back a year or two later, and Kindred's not available, so he brings Buddy Jackson with him, and they have the first black versus skilled black wrestler versus skilled black wrestler matches in the Carolinas. So that's Blackman versus Jackson. And then when Claiborne starts carrying around his Negro World Heavyweight Championship belt, he links up with Buddy Jackson, and they start touring the Carolinas as well, offering a Negro World Heavyweight Championship bout. But before that is when Blackman puts together his all black wrestling tour and starts to tour Alabama and Tennessee. And he brings the Black Panther Alex Kaffner with him. That's when he really starts to introduce Buddy Jackson to audiences. And he also uses that as an opportunity to introduce Frank James to audiences as well.
Yeah.
So
And I want to jump in there. You said, in the upper decks, the black audience. I when I first broke into business, that was still going on. I wrestled in Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and that was the thing. The white audience just sat on the floor, and the balcony was all the black audience, and then the hills, of course, would really play to the black audience and the upper decks there. And our good friend Sputnik Monroe had a lot to do with bringing the black audience down to the floor there.
yeah, yeah.
It was one of the reasons that you had more integration. We want to think that people, realize that basically it was wrong to have segregation.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
in the case of the black baseball leagues, the black baseball leagues were out drawing the white baseball leagues, and it was better baseball in a lot of ways. People wanted to see Satchel Paige, they want to see Josh Gibson, they want to see Cool Papa Bill, they want to see Buck Leonard. They want
Turkey
to see
Stearns.
That's right.
So
They warned us.
I'm from Detroit. I gotta get Turkey Stearns. I gotta get a Turkey Stearns
Absolutely,
reference.
absolutely. I tell you, one of the greatest museums in the world is the Negro League Baseball Museum in Kansas City. Oh my God, that's I was in heaven when I went out there to walk through it. But the black baseball was outdrawing white baseball. Baseball was better, which now they didn't care about that, but they did care about the money because they were
Mhm.
making so much more money. Was that the case with black wrestlers as well? Do you realize, man, we're leaving out like in the case of Sputnik Monroe? One of the reasons he said, "Look, they're paying money too. There's no
Mhm.
reason not we're missing a good part of our population." Was that a big factor in it?
It seemed to be. To me, the most obvious case of this happening when you go out to Australia. I suspect that out in Australia, people were taking notes when Sealy Samara and Jack Claiborne showed up, and the Australians went absolutely nuts for them. And polls were taken, and they were declared to have been the most popular wrestlers to have ever appeared in Australia, and the press couldn't get enough of them. I suspect that might have had something to do with it. And unfortunately, that era of guys seemed to miss the boat. At the tail end of this, at the tail end of the book, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to do it. No, I wanted to write the book. Mike Johnson, a PW insider who's a very good friend of mine and who wrote the foreword to the book, when he got done reading it, he said, "This book reads like the Star Wars opening crawl to everything we think we know about black wrestling. Like this is what came before." And this underscores that Bobo Brazil gets his start as Houston Harris in his hometown of Benton Harbor in 1949. So you have decades and decades of guys who were passing through Benton Harbor, quite frankly. Sealy Samara, Rufus Jones, Don Kindred, Jim Mitchell, they all wrestled in Benton Harbor, and more than likely Bobo Brazil got to watch them perform. And in 1949, he's clearly going through his opening paces as a rookie wrestler. And then in 1950, he heads down to Indiana. He's on the card with Lou Thez, and all of a sudden he's Bobo Brazil. And a few years later, he's a major attraction. And that seems to be around the time, again, when Claiborne and Samara have been to Australia, and black wrestlers are starting to be able to appear in the southern states. Somebody got the idea that, hey, there is an also, Al Karasik said he never made more money than when Jack Claiborne, and Al Karasik had a major voice in the NWA, and he's saying he never made more money than when Jack Claiborne was the champion in Hawaii. Um, the the idea was getting out there that there was money to be made by promoting black wrestlers as being on an equal playing field with a lot of the white wrestlers. And unfortunately, again, this is more of a Gentleman Jack Rough Rufus story than it is a Decided Novelty story. But you have Jack Claiborne, who by the mid 1950s is quite broken down. He's mended things with Karasik, and he comes back to Hawaii, and he's lost his athleticism. He's like a pitcher who's lost his fastball. I won't say I'm friends with Frank Tanana, but he goes to my church, or he goes to my church back in Southfield, Michigan, and he was definitely a guy who lived lived off his fastball, lost his fastball due to injury, and he got by on a lot of off-speed stuff and throwing pitches from different angles. And Claiborne, by the mid 1950s, is like a pitcher who's lost his fastball. He's adopted the headbutt of Rufus Jones, which he did in 1948 in Hawaii. And the way guys started headbutting is actually a pretty funny story because um, Rufus is using the headbutt to great effect. And then Jim Mitchell starts headbutting out in Boston in 1946 under a mask, wrestling as an East Indian wrestler. But he takes the mask off and continues headbutting when he goes out to California. And then Jack Claiborne starts to seriously adopt the headbutt in 1948, blending it with his athletic style. So now he's this boxer shuffling, high drop kicking, jumping, headbutting guy, reminiscent of Rocky Johnson, Tony Atlas, and a ton of other guys. He starts doing that in 1948. He wrestles against Sealy Samara in Hawaii in 1949, successfully defends the Negro Championship against him. Samara comes back to Ontario, and all of a sudden, Samara's a headbutting machine for the first time in his career. So it spreads almost like a virus. And now all of the top black wrestling stars in a span of about 4 years, the headbutt becomes a core part of their routine, and everyone else starts to pick it up.
Right.
But in Hawaii, now that Claiborne is down to just his headbutt and nothing else, Karasik puts him with Bobo Brazil as Bobo's tag team partner, and Bobo is a lot taller, a lot stronger, a lot younger, and so there's no comparison at this point. And now Claiborne is on the undercard of the show where Bobo Brazil wrestles Lou Thez for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship for the first time in Hawaii. And just like that, Bobo is off to California, where he's one half of the NWA Tag Team Championships in champions in both Northern and Southern California. And Claiborne is done wrestling for all intents and purposes within a year of that. And it's during that period where they released the trading cards in Canada, the really the first pro wrestling pack of trading cards. And you only have, I think, 4 black wrestlers included in that set. You have, I think it's Bearcat Wright, Luther Lindsay, Bobo Brazil, and Jack Claiborne. And right on Jack Claiborne's card, it says he's the best black pro wrestler of all time. And within 5 years of that, he's dead from suicide in his Los Angeles home.
I want you to know, I saw that about Rufus Jones. That was the first time, for those that are listening, that the headbutt came in as a stereotypical move of a black wrestler. So I subscribed to Grok 4 Heavy a few days ago. The greatest computer in the history of the world. Elon Musk's computer. So I paid my $300 for a month. I don't know if I'll do it again, but so I Googled this just because I was going to do this interview with you because I wanted to see. So I Googled it. Is there any difference between thickness of skull between races? It came out, and there is the thick and sexes and sexes. I didn't ask about sexes, but it listed it. Had it listed like 2 pages of research. White women have the thickest skulls there is. And for anybody who's been married to a white woman for 20 something years, you will agree with that. This is well known. But it's now documented scientific fact. There's no difference between white, black, Samoan, any Mexican, or anything else. But white women do have a thicker skull than anybody else, according to Grok 4. I'm not making this up.
Thank you, JBL.
I'm not making this up.
Now I can go to my wife and don't headbutt me because you got a thick skull.
That's right. I will send this. I'm going to send this to you guys just to show you that I didn't Google. I Grok 4'd it, which is the best computer in the history of the world.
But again, that speaks to one of the reasons why I was curious about this, because I'm watching, of course, JYD, of course, Coco Beware to a degree had a head that was impervious to pain, and
sure.
And it's this tradition that's playing out. But again, even as I'm in elementary school, I have kids that are telling me that if I get into a fight, they shouldn't hit me in the head because my head is likely to be thicker than someone else's. So, I mean,
If
that's
you're a white woman, that's correct,
there you go.
according
But
to Grok 4.
but there's this curiosity of where did this come from and where did this first begin to manifest itself on the professional wrestling landscape? And it was one of the questions I wanted the answers to, and fortunately, I was able to get a satisfactory
Well,
answer to
I
it.
can tell you, years ago, I was doing commentary. We had a commentator because he didn't mean it, just a slip of the tongue. Samoan had used a headbutt or an Islander. I'm not sure who it was. And the commentator said something to the effect of, "We know Samoans have hard heads," something like that. Vince McMahon blew a gasket. He said, "That is racist. Don't ever say that again." And that was it. And but that was the stereotype. That was the
Yeah.
stereotype of so
Yeah.
much back then, and it was really interesting to see where all that started with Rufus Jones.
Yeah, but
When I first broke in, guys like Tom Nash and Tom Jones and guys like that, they would use the headbutt, and Leroy and Danny Williams, who was the color guy, would specify when they use that because their skull is thicker. African Americans' heads are thicker. And what are they talking about?
well,
But anyway, I want to get to Claiborne when he tried to go to JBL's state of Texas. He was prevented from wrestling there because Texas prevented the matches between black and whites. Did I read that right in your notes?
yeah, they
Don't blame
act.
that on Texas.
Well, who else am I going to blame on? It says right here, black and white.
Yeah, it was codified in the law, and the promoter tried to get around it by claiming that Claiborne was of Cuban extraction.
So
Um,
if you're a black Cuban, you could still get around. You could.
well, it was probably you probably could have gotten around it if you looked closer to Clarence Bolden, if you were or if you were lighter skinned. I think part of that might have been owed to the fact that you had Kid Chocolate boxing in the lower weight classes, who was Cuban, who was a very popular world champion. I honestly don't know, but the bottom line is yes, Texas actually did have a law on the books that prevented black wrestlers from wrestling against white wrestlers. And so, in the absence of Claiborne having anyone else black to wrestle against in Texas, he couldn't participate in the matches in El Paso. He had to wrestle in Mexico on the other side of the river.
Yeah.
Was there anything that you found out in your book that because you did so much research on so many different guys? I recommend a Decided Novelty to anybody out there. It's just absolutely fantastic. But was there anything out there that surprised you about this, or is anything out there that came up that was something that you didn't expect at all that you learned?
The Clarence Bolden thing, honestly, the Clarence Bolden thing was an absolute shocker. And again, it's one of those Easter egg things where you really had to be doing your research and going line by line, or you would have missed it. Because I started this with the idea that okay, you got Vero Small in the 1880s and 1890s, and then you've got this 20-year gap until the next major guy, who was Ilacuba Vincent, and then you've got Reginald Siki. And it's as I'm doing the Illa Vincent research where they start talking about Clarence Bolden. And I'm saying, that's interesting. Let me look up Clarence Bolden, who's allegedly Cuban, because Bolden doesn't sound like a very Cuban name to me. And I start looking that up, and that's when I start finding the mentions where he's Negro. He's a full-blooded Negro. And I said, well, that's very interesting. Let me look up a picture of this guy. Okay, he doesn't look very black to me. So now let's do a deep dive into his background, and that's when you end up no, that's when I end up on ancestry.com, pulling his marriage records, pulling the census records, and seeing, yeah, here he is listed as black, married to a black wife, living in an all black neighborhood. And now here he is in Cleveland, listed as white, marrying in later years a white woman, officially and now in every official document he signs for the remainder of his life, he's white. That's astonishing. And especially when I found the reports of his criminal history in Missouri. And to me, that was a game changer, because I'm like, okay, this is a perfect story to include in the book, because then you have the question of, okay, the best pound for pound wrestler in the world for a period of time was arguably black. Nobody knew about it. Because he was light-skinned enough to pass, he saw his opportunity to avoid living under segregation, and he took it. How much do you want to blame him for taking that outlet when it presented itself? But I mean, he's a perfect figure to include in the book, because it speaks to the nature of the times and just how hard things were. And I'm sure that wasn't a particularly easy decision for him to make.
Sure. Well, Ian, thank you so much for coming on. This me and oh man, when Mr. Briscoe told me we had you, I was so excited, and then you sent me a wonderful list of notes of the book, and it's just been so much fun to read it and research it, and it's what an incredible topic that you had for this book, and what an incredible job you
But
did
when you
researching
get
the book.
this, John, this is the thing here.
That's right. I don't have the book yet. I've got very detailed notes that Ian was kind enough to send me, which I've read over 2 or 3 times, because I'm a slow reader and I'm not very smart, so I had to read them several times.
Not
But
true.
but it's just absolutely fascinating. So Ian, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank
I
you.
wish you the best of luck, and I can't wait to see your book when you come out on our other good friend Mike Rotundo.
Hey, thank you so much for inviting me on your platform. I'm not owed space on anybody's platform, and I have a lot of respect for both of you guys. Not only as wrestlers, but as podcasters. So I was shocked when I got the invitation, and I've never accepted an invitation any faster. So thank you so much for having
Well,
me.
when I got the book in the mail, I looked at it. Holy cow! How can we not do this book here? I mean, John and I love to go back in history and talk about history, and this is such an important subject. So I really thank you for putting this book out about the history of black wrestlers. It's going to sit proudly in my library. I can't wait to really dive deep into this book and start reading. But once again, as John said, thank you so much for your notes. They were fantastic. I couldn't wait to send them to John, because I knew what John's reaction would be. Wow, why are we
Oh
waiting
yeah,
for
I
you?
loved them. I couldn't wait to read them.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, and Gerald. Safe travels to Iowa if you're heading up there.
Yeah, we both are. We both are.
Yep.
So
Hit them
Oh,
tomorrow.
hopefully we'll be up there. Come up there. You just need to come up there and let people know who you are, and get around. And we have tables where you can sell your books and all that stuff. So we'd
Yeah, and I
love
tell
to
you what
have
we'll
you come
do,
up
and
there.
we can talk about it all fair. When you come up to Iowa, we'll do a nice panel with you, and go over your book, especially the historic book, and see if we can't do something for you up there. That'd be pretty cool.
that'd be awesome, guys. Thank you so much.
Awesome, thank you.